My name is Peter Bowen. My age is 95, but I'll be 96 in August. I was a mid-upper gunner in a Lancaster bomber in the Royal Air Force.
But what's the document that you're actually looking at there?
I'm looking at my diary for 1944.
Whoa.
Yes, the original diary.
An estimated 1.6 billion people would serve in World War II. And no matter what side, Peter's story is very similar to the others. What would start as a teenage dream for adventure would soon become a mind-numbing reality, and in years to come would transform into a lifelong reflection. This is Peter's story.
It was in the 1930s, and I was in my teens, as I say. And my dad very, very wisely ordered a magazine called the Children's Newspaper. So I got an interest in what was going on in the world. And I began to realize that this man Hitler was going to be causing a lot of trouble. None of us were surprised when a war began. We got used to the idea by then that eventually it would have to come to war. But I didn't dream that I would be part of it.
Hitler was well on his way to conquering Europe, terrorizing each country in his path. Great Britain was one of the last democratic strongholds on Hitler's list. And in 1940, Hitler engaged in an aerial assault that would send Great Britain into extreme action.
My home was right under their flight path. So I used to watch some of the battles from my back garden. We could hear the clatter of machine guns. Then occasionally a plane would come spiraling down with great smoke behind it and crash behind the trees. By 1941, it was obvious that this was going to drag on for a long time. Well, there came a time I had to register for military service, like all young men of 19. And I couldn't fancy myself shoving a bayonet into another human being. So I thought, well, if I become a pilot, then I'll be firing at another plane. I won't see the pilot, it'll be a bit distant. But the doctor said, oh, I'm sorry. He said, you've got astigmatism.
The British Air Force were in desperate need of airmen, so Peter put his teenage dreams of becoming a fighter pilot aside and enrolled to become a bomber navigator.
Well, I did okay in the classrooms, which is fairly leisurely, but my math has never been all that great, and in the air, I was too slow. So I was told politely that I would never be a navigator. And the officer, he said, I think we'll make you an air gunner. We're always very short of air gunners. I didn't realize the significance of that at the time. He did, he knew what he was talking about, because the air gunner was the position that the enemy fighters always aim for, and the plane is defenseless. So I became an air gunner. While I was doing training in Canada, I trained only with air gunners. Pilots trained just with pilots, and so on. But when we got back to England, we went to what was called a training unit, and when we got there, the commanding officer got us all in the big gymnasium, probably 500 of us, and said, no, he said, you see that hangar over there? Well then, I want you all to go over to that hangar every day and choose your own mates, and then let us know. How about that for democracy?
The Lancaster bomber required a crew of 7, a pilot, navigator, flight engineer, wireless operator, bombardier, mid-upper gunner, and rear gunner.
The only other member of our crew at that time was the other rear gunner. We graduated together from the gunnery course in Canada. So he and I went over like all the rest, and we looked around, and we were approached by a bombardier, and he said, by the way, I've already got a wireless operator that I got to know.
Peter's crew slowly began to take form, and while most other crews were flying, Peter's crew was still missing someone very important, a pilot.
And one day I happened to notice an officer pilot who was a flight lieutenant. In other words, he'd been around the block a few times, and this was his second tour. So I went up to him, and I sort of flung up a big salute, yes, you know. And I said, are you still looking for a crew, sir? And this flight lieutenant said, well, for crying, he said, I was wondering when someone was going to notice me. Yeah, so we got together, and he became our pilot.
The newly formed crew would join a small squadron of 12 Lancaster bombers, all of which were led by a young Flight Lieutenant Orders. Their target was Germany's industrial area.
We'd been on the squadron about 3 weeks, but then there came a day when we saw our names up on what was called the battle order, and that was a sheet of paper posted in the mess, and we saw our crew's names on the battle order for the first time. I can still remember it. We thought, oh, this is it. No more fairy tales, no more pretending this is the real thing. And I remember it was a daylight raid on a Saturday morning on a big industrial town in the Ruhr to a place called Duisburg. Our flight commander, not our pilot, but the pilot in charge of our squadron, who were 12 planes, he woke us up about 1:30 that morning. He went round to every barricade and, made sure that we were up. We'd taken off about 6, you see, after breakfast and the briefing. At about 8:30 that morning, we were nearing over the target in Duisburg. And his plane was flying alongside ours, and we saw his plane hit and fall in flames. And that was the end of Flight Lieutenant Aldous' crew.
In 1944, at the height of the war, almost every Allied country had launched a bombing offensive on Nazi Germany, bombing their cities, factories, and railways. But the Nazi cities were heavily guarded with searchlights and anti-aircraft guns. As a result, bomber crews suffered a 46% death rate, which means over half the bomber crews never returned.
A scary scene, with the searchlights looking for you and the fear of being attacked by a night fighter and the anti-aircraft shells bursting all around you. I watched more than one Lancaster shot down. But I can remember looking out at those aircraft going down and quite almost as though I'm watching a movie, sort of a bit disengaged. And I still think that there was some kind of psychological denial comes down to preserve you.
By 1945, Peter and his crew had flown 25 operations over Germany. A combined continual bombing effort had taken its toll on Hitler and the Nazi regime.
Yeah, well, that was me towards the end of my flying career. I'm amazed that I look so cheerful.
What was the date of your last mission?
April the 24th, 1945. That was to Berchtesgaden, which was Hitler's little hideaway in the Bavarian Alps. It was a big effort, there were several hundred planes on the effort, but there was hardly any opposition. There was just the odd puff of anti-aircraft fire. By then, the Germans, they knew they were beaten. They hadn't got any more fight left in them, so there was almost no opposition. And we thought Hitler was down there, you see, they're making a last stand in his retreat.
6 days after the bombing of Berchtesgaden, Hitler commits suicide in Berlin.
I can't say it was euphoric because we were all pretty tired by then. Everybody was, even civilians at home. We'd all had it up to here with Hitler, and we were wiped. So we had that feeling of, whew, it's all over, we've survived, we've come through. It was a wonderful feeling, I do remember that so well.
Hitler and his Nazi regime had been terrorizing the world for over 6 years. It had finally come to an end. Today, Peter is still fighting. He frequently visits schools, sharing his stories of what he strongly believes can prevent World War II from happening again.
What is your message to the future generation then?
Yeah, well, the message I like to leave with them is twofold. One is the time to stop all the nonsense is in elementary school, where the kids are taught to be helpful and kind to each other. And secondly is to make sure that when you're old enough, you get out and vote to choose whom you want to lead your country or your province or your town. And say that the German people had no choice. They were led by a dictator, and that dictator said to them, do as I say, and if you don't, I'm going to shoot you, period. But take an interest, if you can, in what's going on in the world. And when you're 18, it's very important to you to exercise that vote and to choose who you want to lead.
Regardless of the side, there's no winner. But what we gained from World War II are many of the freedoms we enjoy today. So with respects to Peter and the millions of people who lost their lives, make sure you show kindness, exercise your freedom to vote, and help make this world a better place. Thank you for listening to Peter's story.